You're a little kid, and we have many of them who come into school and they're great little talkers and they know a lot of words. If they don't learn how to decode those words in print, their reading ability and comprehension ability is not going to be very good.
In your work, have you come across strong trends or discussions in the area of language comprehension in addition to that sound symbol correspondence that we've talked a lot about in terms of phonics instruction?
For sure. And I would say that understanding the relationship between language comprehension and word identification in that simple view of reading equation that I'm sure some listeners know, but maybe some don't. And that's simply it was a theory, an idea that was put out in 1986 to try to sort of explain what was known about reading. And it's been further tested for years and years and shown to hold up really well. And that's this, you can think of it as sort of an equation, which is reading comprehension, which is the goal. We want everyone to be able to read the words and understand what they say, get meaning from text. Everyone agrees that's the goal. And the understanding is that that can be thought of as an equation, which is it's your word identification ability, which is kind of complex in and of itself, but your ability to actually read and identify the words times your language comprehension, like all the words and that you know the meaning of. And not just the words you know the meaning of, but lots of things you understand about language and how it works, right? That was actually an equation that I would say how that simple view of reading equation, which does not say that reading is simple. It's just a simple way to understand what reading comprehension is. Word identification times language comprehension. So what it shows is that if you have lots of really good language comprehension, you're a little kid, and we have many of them who come into school and they're great little talkers and they know a lot of words. If they don't learn how to decode those words in print, their reading ability and comprehension ability is not going to be very good. And the opposite is true. You can learn how to decode words, but if you don't know the meaning of very many words, if you don't know that much about spoken language and how it works, your reading comprehension isn't going to be very good. I wrote about that in Hard Words, like I presented that equation back then. It seemed like a very important part of it, and wrote about it in the New York Times after that. So I feel like that's a really important idea that needs to be understood by everyone. I think it's true that a lot of my work has focused on the word identification part of the equation, because that's where I identify that there was a real problem. Not saying that there's not problems with the other part and the other part isn't important. But as I looked at this as a reporter, that was where I saw this real breakdown in terms of misunderstanding of what that's all about. Because as you look through history, what you see and what you see in this idea that I was talking about in Sold a Story is that it misunderstands the importance of being able to decode the words. It says like, oh yeah, well that's one thing you can do, but there's all these other things you can do. And it's no. If kids don't have solid decoding ability, they're never going to get to that reading comprehension where we all want them to get. So the sort of whole language idea and balanced literacy that grew out of whole language, I think the fundamental problem is that it misunderstands that there is a distinction between language comprehension and decoding ability. It mushes them together as if they're one thing. And what we do know is they become one thing. You put them together and it becomes the thing we all want. But the sort of, which comes first, the chicken or the egg, the cause and the effect, sort of disentangling what are the pieces that kids need to become good readers. It's just, if you look back through history, you see this real profound misunderstanding of the importance of and the way to get to good word recognition skills.
I would agree. And I think that one way that we've tackled this issue in our research is to think of it as two separate lines of study. And that's helped to disentangle that a bit, because some have said, the science of reading is only around phonics or word recognition. But as you mentioned, Liz, I've been a part of decades of work on language comprehension that is really separate of word reading. We know that language comprehension starts developing from birth, and that it is not something that goes to the wayside when children learn how to read words. But once they start to learn how to read words, at the same time, an instruction and assessment can involve language comprehension. And language comprehension has its own unique developmental trajectory. We know that it has its own unique malleable characteristics. And there's been decades of research funded by the Department of Education and the National Institutes of Health that have resulted in a science of reading around language comprehension that is not perhaps as intense in terms of the number of articles around word reading, but it has the same depth and breadth of instructional, aspects and cognitive science underpinnings as we do in word recognition. And so I often see, like you, Emily, when I go into schools, talk to teachers and educators, they'll say, but what about language? What about language when we're talking about systematic and explicit phonics instruction? It's not an either or, it is an and. And so we really try to think through that with educators. And I think this is also where that implementation and translational science has been so helpful, because what was been found, across science is it's not really the efficacy or the impact of the research that's done in a certain area. It's actually the match to the context. So we think a lot about making sure that we're accounting for, even in our very initial studies around, efficacy with language comprehension or word reading, how does it link to the school setting or just the setting you want it to actually, make a difference in? And so then we work in these research practitioner partnerships. We go through a process, which, medicine is so far ahead of us in this way. They've seen that, getting the science done and expecting it to happen in practice just doesn't happen on its own. There's a whole scientific process, the implementation science process, which is a scientific process in and of itself that involves really listening to teachers and listening to what's going on in those contexts, which you've done, Emily, and so brilliantly in the podcast and the reporting you're doing. But I think tying this all together, we have the science of reading that involves both word reading and language comprehension. There's also so many other parts to the science of reading that we hear about too, like how do we work with emerging bilinguals? How do we make sure that the work we're doing is equitable? And those all have their own science of reading, but it's really this science that is the foundation and the implementation science that plays into it as well.
Can I say one thing and actually ask Tiffany this question, because I want you to correct me if I'm wrong. But I think that the simple view of reading and sort of what you talked about before, how there's this sort of these distinct strains of study and recognizing the word recognition and the language comprehension as two different elements that are important to look at in and of themselves. And I think that's incredibly important. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tiffany, I think one of the things that's complex about all that is that we know that they actually do affect each other. They're not necessarily distinct, right? So like a kid who gets decoding ability then has has a key ability to kind of expand their language comprehension through reading. So one of the things we know, right, is that at those earliest stages, like actually for many years, I think up until kids are really in middle school, like their spoken vocabulary tends to be much bigger than their read vocabulary. And then they start to if you become a reader, you actually use words and encounter words and know words through reading that you almost never use in conversation. So I guess the question is, they do, even though they're distinct, they do affect each other.
Absolutely. And I think the way I've tried to think about this in my professional development is almost like a third strand to make it more comprehensible. So it's like you have these two separate strands, but you also have this third strand, which is basically the intersectionality between the two. And they really can play out across different learners. And so it really is not as easy as just two separate strands. However, it can be as easy as that in that way too. So you almost have to attend to all three. So you have to tend to the language comprehension from birth all the way through. And sometimes what happens if you focus too much on the third strand of the intersectionality, what happens is there becomes a volley so that you focus only in the early grades on word reading. But what we have to do is in the early grades also focus on language comprehension at the same time we're focusing on word reading. And by doing those two things, then the intersectionality will play out in the richest form over time. Because as you're learning to read words, the language comprehension is still going along. And actually, you mentioned this, the language comprehension will be ahead of word reading. So when we work with our, language comprehension, intervention studies in, for instance, first grade, the books we use are really more at the second grade level because their language comprehension is ahead of what they can read. And so then you really are on two separate developmental strands, but they do merge and they do affect each other over time. So I think it makes, I'm just reiterating what you're saying and kind of adding to it, because I'm always thinking about what is the best way to describe the complex longitudinal trajectories we see to teachers as they're trying. And I know you think about this often too. How do we do that translation? And I think the 3-strand idea can work well, because I don't want there to be a time in which there isn't instruction in language comprehension. And likewise, we often see that word reading instruction falls off in the later grades. And I know that's something we want to get to, as well as in middle school. What you see is then there's this volley back to like only comprehension and no word reading. And we have to have good continued word identification instruction at the later grades, which also feeds into your language when you start to learn like Latin meanings and derivative morphology. It really helps to think through that.